What is your story about getting revenge on your neighbor? Story 1. On a week-long cruise, first 2 mornings, our neighbors on both sides were ridiculously loud and basically screaming in Spanish and constantly waking us up. We didn't go to bed until 3 or 4 a.m., so they cut into your sleep. On third night at around 10 or 11 p.m., we got into our room, blasted the TV. Side note, TVs on cruises should be programmed to not go as loud as we made it, and left it like that until 3 or 4 a.m. You could hear it outside our door. It was very loud like they were. The next morning, what do you know, the neighbors realized other people can hear them and were quiet the rest of the cruise. Story 2. Years ago, my upstairs neighbors were wanted felons living in an apartment leased by the lady's brother. They sold drugs out of there. They fucked all times of the day, loud music 8 a.m. through 12 a.m. Locked their daughter outside for hours at a time so we would do things with her and give her snacks, but you could tell her social and educational development was way behind. After finding their pictures online on the MN 50 Most Wanted, I called the police and they didn't believe me. They called me a child. I was 22. All while the neighbors' behavior got worse as more people reported them. It took them around 4 months and dozens of phone calls to finally get the police to arrest fugitives they were supposedly looking for. Story 3. Live in a dorm with a shared kitchen and toilet. One neighbor refused to buy toilet paper and always stole food. During a summer break, only him and me were living at the dorm, and he continued to practice, so I made some stew and put a lot of laxatives in it. I also left only one roll of toilet paper in the bathroom that was covered in itching powder. He was pissed, but I laugh whenever he tries to scold me for it. Story 4. Well, it all started one day when they were having their fence put in, and one of the workers accidentally snapped one of our tomato plants at the base. So she decided to take it inside and cook all of the green tomatoes into this unbelievably yummy Italian food I can't even begin to pronounce or spell, and brought it over as an apology. Then we made fresh cut pasta and gave them some to get the container back because we, of course, didn't want to keep it. Then they had the audacity to make us some Indian dessert thing that tasted like heaven. By then, our garden had started to produce, so we gave them 2 bags of produce that would have gone to waste, and they gave us some eggplant dish. So we brought over a tray of cookies, and now it's 3 years later, and we are in a heated war over who can outfood the other. We're fighting a losing battle, though, because they are vegetarian and we are not, so we have to modify most of what we make for them, but we have a huge vegetable garden, so we have the leg up on that. Story 5. My parents' neighbor constantly blows his leaves onto my parents' property. My dad tried to confront him a few times, but the guy literally ran away every time. Yes, a grown-ass man dropped his leaf blower and ran inside and locked the door and pretended not to be home when he saw my dad coming on multiple occasions. My father is not a scary man. My dad was finally able to confront him one day. He was super polite and said that the guy could blow the leaves into their woods, just not onto their clean lawn. The guy responded, "Your property doesn't start until 10 feet from the road, so you can't do anything about it. If you want me to stop, sue me." This is technically correct, as the property is off a private road owned by a convent, and per state law, the owner of the road also owns the 10 feet of land on either side of the road. So my dad called up the convent and asked if the neighbor is allowed to dump his leaves on their property. Turns out they don't like that. And so now, instead of being a neighborly argument with my parents, he's trying to fight a bunch of nuns in court. Not a good look. Story 6. Had a shitty neighbor that lived downstairs. Did all sorts of loud shit late into the night, usually music and friends. One day I had enough, and after about 10 minutes of very loud music, I just started stomping on the floor. He came bursting out of his apartment and pounding on my door. I answered, acting very confused. "You need to stop stomping around. I'm trying to work." I wasn't stomping. "Yes, you were." "I was dancing to your shitty music. Turn it down and it'll never happen again." It never happened again. Story 7. My neighbor leaves trash in their yard. We have an HOA that is basically as feckless as possible, and this isn't some shitty neighborhood. We're talking 300K in Columbus, Ohio, which is about as upper middle class as you can get in the Midwest. They don't tie up their garbage bags, so some random shit falls out and blows into my yard. I took the 6 pieces I could find and duct taped them to their garage because I wanted them to be aware of the issue. For all of winter, they threw their plastic water bottles into a pile next to their garage, and it kept getting bigger and bigger until the snow melted and it was way too obvious, so they finally trashed it. All of this is too specific, and if my neighbor happens to read it, Then clean up your trash, you fucking Vernon Dursley looking fuck. Story 8. It's more of a Cold War situation. When my boyfriend cuts the grass, even if our neighbor just cut his grass a few days prior, he, our neighbor, will cut his again the next day. He's an old man who can't stand to have his lawn just a smidge taller than ours. Story 9. When I was in elementary school, our neighbor's 4 dogs would always poop in our backyard. My mom asked the neighbor many times to pick it up, but he never did. So, every morning before school, my mom would send me and my brother on poop patrol. At first, we just put the poop in the neighbor's yard, but our neighbor never got the hint. My mom then had us put the poop on his porch, and then he got a fence. Story 10. I lived next door to a cocaine club for years. They'd start up around 11 p.m. or midnight and go till dawn. The cops, Brooklyn, were clearly on the take, as they'd repeatedly tell me during the day the place had been closed down, and yet they were showing up 3 or 4 times a week there to deal with fights. I asked one of them about why they couldn't close the place at 4 a.m. one day after a particularly noisy fight, and they wouldn't even look me in the eye. We had a huge number of beer bottles because I also used the place as a performance and rehearsal space, so at a certain point I'd start throwing bottles out my window to smash at their back door when they were noisy. They really hated that, but as I pointed out, what were they going to do? Call the cops? So they eventually managed to keep the noise down. It kinda worked out. Eventually they were gentrified out of existence. Apu. Well, if the police won't help us, I guess we'll just have to take the law into our own hands. Chief Wiggum. Yeah, a lot of people are doing that these days. Story 11. Old neighbor from when I lived in town. Was the worst kind of neighbor. Loud at all times of the night, no garbage service, too much traffic in and out to not be dealing drugs, and 2 pit bulls that were either locked inside or on a chain. Subsequently, his dogs are not socialized and extremely aggressive. Both dogs would regularly get loose and attack both my dog and myself. I had a 4-foot chain link fence around my whole yard for my dog, but his dogs would easily jump the fence and attack my dog. After speaking with him several times, calling the police, animal control, etc., I told him I would defend my dog if he wasn't going to control his. Less than a month after that conversation, his dogs again jumped the fence and attacked my dog, this time causing severe damage to my dog, emergency vet visit, and he nearly died. He learned I was good to my word that day. Story 12. My newish neighbor was a goddamn sex maniac. Every night I heard him screwing his boyfriend, and they were loud. I lived in a house with a good amount of space between my home and his. Even with our windows closed, I could hear them screaming like feral cats. My husband finally had enough of it, so he went next door to tell them, politely, to take it down a notch. The next morning he found a giant dildo with a suction cup on the bottom stuck to the hood of his car with "fuck you" carved into the side of his car. His brand new car. Cops were called. They denied it. We had it on camera. They were meth heads. Don't do meth, kids. Story 13. Back in 2009 or 2010, I was at war with my downstairs neighbor. She would hit her ceiling with a broomstick, and I would point my bass speaker down toward the floor. I got pregnant with twins that were high risk, and got a temporary handicap placard for parking closer. She borrowed one and took my spot. A few months go by of straight war, and then I had my twins. I'll be damned if we didn't stop fucking with each other, and that woman was the only person to help me. We became best friends, and still are to this day. We still laugh at our silly war. Thank you, Heather.